The Hawthorne family had lived in Frostbane Manor for a long time. The old house was high on a cold and icy cliff. It looked like a ghost and was reminding everyone of their long history. The weather was always harsh, with snow and strong winds. It felt like the land itself was sad and alive. For the Hawthornes, this place was not a choice. It had been forced on them. Long ago, the first Hawthornes came to this cold place. They wanted to be rich and powerful, but they didn't find fortune. Instead, they found a curse because they had disturbed something old and angry. Because of this, their family was stuck in the frozen wilderness. Every generation of Hawthornes tried to leave, but the curse made sure they couldn't. But the only way to break the curse was through a terrible ritual, and they had to sacrifice innocent people. Elliot Hawthorne, the head of the family, sat quietly by the fire. The flames moved and created shadows on his face. His blue eyes were cold like the ice outside, and he was a man who controlled everything around him. His wife Clara sat next to him, and she wore a velvet gown that moved like dark water. She looked elegant, but her smile hid darkness. Clara was the one who made the plans, and her words always made people believe lies. Their oldest daughter, Lucille, moved around the house like a ghost. She was very beautiful, and her skin was pale like fresh snow, and her hair was dark like night. Her eyes seemed to see through people. She was charming, and she could trick innocent people into coming closer to their doom. But Noah, the youngest, often stared out the window at the snow. Unlike the others, he seemed sad, and his heart was torn. He wanted to be loyal to his family, but he didn't like what they were doing. As the family prepared for winter, Elliot spoke in a low voice. "It won't be long now," he said. "Travelers always come and look for shelter from the storm." His words felt heavy, like something big was about to happen. Outside, the wind howled louder, and the manor seemed alive with whispers. It was as if the walls knew what was coming. Now the family waited, just like always, and they were getting more desperate. And far away, in the cold wilderness, fate was already moving their plan forward. Somewhere in the cold region, the government research team walked through the thick snow, and their breath was visible in the cold air. Dr. Michael Carter led the group, and his sharp eyes scanned the endless white land. This cold place was their mission because they were here to study strange geothermal activity that had confused scientists around the world. Behind him, Sophia Bennett fixed her goggles as the cold wind stung her cheeks. She loved discovering new things, but even she felt unsure because of the freezing cold. Eric Mitchell, who was carrying most of the heavy equipment, complained with sarcastic jokes. He tried to hide his growing worrying with humor. Jessica Hart, who was always kind, did her best to keep everyone in a good mood, while Daniel Brooks, the newest member, struggled to keep up. After walking 4 hours, the team set up camp near a strange geothermal vent. Because the land around them was very still, almost as quiet as if the world was holding its breath. "Feels wrong, doesn't it?" Eric said, breaking the silence. Michael looked back at him sharply, but he also felt something was off deep inside. The first night was filled with restlessness because their equipment began acting weird. GPS signals stopped working, and batteries drained very quickly. Sophia thought she heard faint whispers outside the tent, but when she checked, she only found the howling wind. Daniel, looking scared, said he saw shadows moving across the snow, but there was nothing when they went outside. As the night went on, the team became more nervous. Now the air felt heavier, and their breathing quickened as a strange vibration moved through the ground, like something was shifting below them. Michael tried to calm everyone and said it was just normal seismic activity, but the others looked at each other and worried. When morning finally came, the group saw something in the distance. Through the snowstorm, they saw a dark shape standing alone in the white landscape, and it looked like a manor. They didn't know what it was or why it was there, but something about it made them want to go closer. It promised warmth, and maybe answers to the strange things they had felt. But as they decided to investigate, they all felt a growing fear, and with every step toward the manor, it felt like they were going deeper into the unknown. Then, the explorers stood in front of the big shape of Frostbane Manor. Its old stone walls were covered in frost, like a ghostly cover. The manor looked both beautiful and scary, and stood alone in the cold and empty wilderness. With each careful step they took toward the large wooden doors, they felt more uneasy. Michael knocked on the door, and the sound echoed loudly in the quiet air. A few moments later, the door slowly opened, and a man appeared in the doorway. Elliot Hawthorne, his piercing blue eyes, quickly looked at the group, and then he smiled, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Travelers, in this weather, you must be frozen. Come in," Elliot said warmly and waved them inside. Inside the manor, everything was different from the cold outside. A big fire crackled in a grand fireplace, and the smell of spiced cider filled the air, and it made the place feel strangely welcoming. Clara, Elliot's wife, greeted them with a calm smile. Her voice was soft and her movements slow. Lucille, their daughter, stood quietly in the background and watched them carefully, as if her eyes were taking in every detail. As they took off their cold jackets and boots, the Hawthornes offered them food and drinks. Even though they were welcomed warmly, Michael felt something was wrong, because the warmth inside the manor felt perfect, like it was hiding something. Then Clara said with a light tone, "We haven't had visitors in years," almost like she wanted to ignore the uncomfortable silence. "This place isn't exactly friendly to travelers, is it?" Then Sophia said, "We are here on a research project, and we are studying geothermal activity and some strange things in the area." "Strange things, you say?" Elliot's smile disappeared for a second, but just long enough for Michael to notice. He narrowed his eyes, but kept his voice calm. "Have you noticed anything strange, like changes in the ground, or vibrations?" Meanwhile, Lucille moved closer to Daniel, and her presence drew him in. "You must be very brave to come all this way," she said softly, and her voice sweet. "Not many people can handle the cold like you." Daniel blushed and nervously tried to answer, but Eric, who was standing a little farther away, watched the conversation carefully. Then he frowned, but didn't say anything. As the night passed, the family's warmth stayed the same, but their words often felt strange and uncomfortable. When Michael mentioned the strange shadows they had seen outside, Elliot's face became serious for a moment before he laughed it off. "You must have imagined things," Elliot said with a fake laugh. "The mind plays tricks on you at places like this." Even though the family was kind, something still felt wrong, because the explorers were safe inside the manor, but they felt like they were getting trapped in an invisible way, hidden by warmth, soft words, and the flickering firelight. Later, the explorers settled into the manor, and they were happy to be away from the cold outside. Clara made sure their rooms were warm and comfortable, and the rooms were decorated nicely. Elliot kept the conversation going with interesting stories about the land, which made the place feel more relaxed. At first, the tension seemed to disappear, and the group started to get along better with their hosts. Eric even joked about staying longer, and his dry humor made everyone laugh. But Michael still felt uneasy because his instincts told him that the kindness of their hosts felt perfect to practice. As the days went on, Michael decided to ask more questions. One evening, during dinner, he turned to Elliot and asked, "You have been here for generations, and what keeps you here in such isolation?" Elliot paused. His knife stopped in the middle of cutting, and he seemed to think carefully before answering. "It is our home," he said simply, "and our roots are deep." Sophia noticed the pause and looked at Michael because she felt that something was wrong. Meanwhile, Noah, the youngest of the Hawthornes, started to act strangely during meals because he seemed distant and avoided looking his family in the eye. This was especially clear when Jessica, the biologist, asked him about the local plants. One evening, when they were alone in the library, Noah spoke quietly. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, and his voice was soft. Then Jessica frowned. "Why? What do you mean?" Before Noah could answer, Lucille appeared in the doorway and her face was cold. Then she said, "Noah, Father needs you," and her voice didn't allow any argument. Later that evening, Lucille paid attention to Daniel. She moved closer to him, her voice soft and strong. Then she said, "You're special," looking deep into his eyes. "I can see it." Daniel, wanting to impress her, enjoyed the attention, and not realizing how her words were slowly taking hold of his mind. But Michael saw what was happening. He noticed the family's small ways of controlling them. The way Lucille charmed Daniel, how Elliot always avoided certain questions, and how Clara's kind words sometimes felt like they were guiding the group in a quiet way. That night, as Michael lay in bed, he heard whispers again. They were soft but seemed to be calling to him, like voices carried on the wind. Then he sat up. His heart was racing, and his instincts screamed that the warmth of the manor was just a cover. Something terrible was hidden beneath it. Morning came with an unnatural stillness, as if the air was holding its breath. When Jessica knocked on Daniel's door to wake him for breakfast, there was no answer. At first, she thought he was just sleeping in, because he might have been tired from the cold and the tension. But when she opened the door, her heart sank. Daniel's bed was perfectly made, and his things were untouched. His coat and boots, which he needed if he planned to go outside, were still in the corner where he had left them. It was like he had disappeared into thin air. Then Jessica rushed to the others in the dining room and said, "Daniel's gone." "What do you mean, gone?" Michael asked, already standing up. Jessica quickly explained what she had found, and her words rushed and filled with panic. Then the group immediately began searching every room in the manor and shouting Daniel's name into the cold and empty air outside. Then the Hawthornes quickly offered their help. Elliot, who was always calm, seemed almost unnerving as he said, "We will do everything we can to find him. This land can be dangerous, but he couldn't have gone far." Clara, who was always in control, added, "The wilderness plays tricks on the mind. Perhaps he became confused, so we must act quickly." But Michael felt something was wrong, because he couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. Why would Daniel leave without his coat or boots? It didn't make sense. Then the group decided to split into pairs. Michael and Jessica took the outer perimeter and walked through the deep snow, while Sophia and Eric searched the manor again and focused on the less obvious areas. As hours passed with no sign of Daniel, the fear in their hearts grew. The wind howled and carried strange whispers that almost seemed to mock their search. Shadows flickered in the corners of their eyes, only to disappear when they turned to look. By evening, the group came back together and their faces were tired and full of worrying. "We have to think about the possibility that something happened to him," Michael said, his voice heavy with concern. "Something," Eric snapped, his frustration showing. "What kind of something, Michael? He didn't just vanish." Now the air was thick with tension, and the Hawthornes, watching from the side, exchanged small and knowing looks. As night fell, Clara softly suggested, "You all should rest and tomorrow will bring answers." But no one could rest. In the quiet of their rooms, the explorers lay awake and thinking about Daniel's disappearance and the growing feeling that the manor itself held the answers they were too afraid to face. Determined to leave, Michael gathered the group early the next morning. He stood at the head of the dining table and his jaw set with determination. "We are not giving up, and we will search again. Thoroughly. We will check the manor, the grounds, and everything in between." Eric muttered under his breath and clearly frustrated. "We have already looked everywhere, Michael." "Then we will look again," Michael snapped, his patience wearing thin. "I think he's here, somewhere." Then the group split into pairs. Sophia and Eric stayed inside to search the manor for hidden rooms or clues, while Michael and Jessica ventured outside and braved the bitter cold to expand their search. Inside the manor, Sophia and Eric searched every nook and cranny. Suddenly, it was Sophia who noticed something strange first. A faint scratch on the floorboards in a dusty storage room. Kneeling down, she ran her fingers over the marks. "These are fresh," she whispered, her breath visible in the cold air. Then Eric joined her and looked over her shoulder. "Looks like something has been moved." Together, they pushed aside an old cabinet, and this revealed a hidden trapdoor. The wood was old and splintered, with an iron ring embedded in its center. But Sophia hesitated. "Do we open it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eric glanced around the room, as if expecting someone or something to stop them. "Not yet. We need the others." Just then, faint voices drifted up from the trapdoor. They weren't words exactly, but low and guttural murmurs that sent a chill down their spines. The sound grew louder, then stopped abruptly. "Let's go," Eric said, gripping Sophia's arm. Then they left the room quickly, and their footsteps were silent and fast. Meanwhile, outside, Michael and Jessica struggled against the relentless wilderness. Because the snow, blinding and cold, gave them no clues. As they circled back toward the manor, Jessica spotted Noah standing near a tree. "Noah," she called, and her voice carried through the icy air. He didn't turn, but when she reached him, he finally spoke, and his voice low and serious. "You should leave." Jessica's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" "You are not safe here," Noah said urgently. "None of us are." Before Jessica could ask him more, Lucille's voice called from the manor doorway. "Jessica, dear, come inside. It is too cold out here." Reluctantly, Jessica turned away and left Noah behind with his secrets and his quiet guilt. Meanwhile, Sophia wandered through the dim hallways of the manor, and her flashlight flickering against the old wallpaper. But she felt uneasy, and the feeling didn't go away. When she opened the creaking door to the manor's library, the air felt colder and heavier. Shelves lined with dusty, old books surrounded her, and the room seemed to hide secrets that had been there for years. Then, her eyes fell on a leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked because it was so old, and it was slightly open on a desk. Curious, she walked over to it and brushed off the thick dust before opening it carefully. The journal belonged to Henry Hawthorne, an ancestor from a century ago. At first, the entries seemed normal because they described life during the harsh winters in the frozen region. But as Sophia read more, she got a cold feeling. The later entries spoke of a dark curse. The family was trapped on the land and could not leave unless they made sacrifices of outsiders to please the frost, a bad spirit that kept them stuck. Henry's writings said that sacrifices were needed to keep the family alive and delay their madness. Then, Sophia slammed the journal shut because she was scared. She started breathing quickly, and everything started to make sense now. The family's strange behavior, the whispers in the walls, and Danielle's disappearance. Then, she rushed to find the others and was holding the journal tightly in her hands. "This is what's happening here," she said, slamming the book onto the dining table where the group had gathered. "This family is cursed, and we are the ones they need to escape." Then, the Hawthornes entered the room. Just as Sophia finished speaking, Elliot's face stayed calm, but there was something in his eyes that was hard to understand. Clara smiled, but it seemed to smooth and to fake. Then, Elliot said in a calm voice, "That journal is just an old family heirloom. It is full of silly stories passed down through the generations. Surely, you don't believe such nonsense." Michael stood up and his jaw clenched. "And what about Daniel?" Is his disappearance part of this silly story too? Suddenly, Lucille stepped forward, and her voice was soft but cold. We have only offered you warmth and safety in this harsh place. If you repay us with baseless accusations, maybe you should leave. Then, Sophia gripped the journal tightly in her hands and said, "We are leaving tonight." The Hawthornes exchanged quiet glances. Their calm faces hid something darker and something dangerous. As the explorers went to their rooms to pack, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, because the walls seemed to whisper and give off warnings she couldn't understand. Somewhere deep within the manor, something shifted, as if waiting. Nighttime came, but the tension didn't go away. Michael quickly told everyone to get ready to leave. As the group gathered their things, Eric came back from checking the vehicles with bad news. "They are useless," Eric said, throwing down his gloves in frustration. "The engines won't start, and it is like they have been frozen solid." Michael's face went serious. "What about the satellite phone?" he asked, his voice tight with worrying. Sophia held up the phone, and her hand shook. "It is dead now. I charged it 2 hours ago. It shouldn't be dead." The realization hit them all at once, because they were completely cut off. While the others argued about what to do next, Lucille walked over to Eric. Her movements were smooth and graceful, but there was something strange about the way her icy blue eyes seemed to study him as she spoke softly. "You all look so tense. Why don't you let me show you something that might help?" Eric hesitated for a moment, but then he felt curious. He followed her down a narrow hall, and she stopped in front of a locked door. Then Lucille unlocked it and opened it to reveal a room full of strange objects. Carved bones, frostbitten relics, and a map covered with strange symbols. "This is part of our history," Lucille said, her voice soft and smooth. "Wouldn't you like to know more about the land you are so eager to leave?" Eric couldn't resist. Then, he stepped inside, and his curiosity took over. As soon as he did, Lucille closed the door behind him, and then her calm smile turned into something darker. Meanwhile, back in the main hall, Michael noticed that Eric was missing. "Where is Eric?" he asked, and looked around the room with concern. Sophia and Jessica looked at each other nervously. "He was here a minute ago," Jessica said, her voice uncertain. Minutes passed, then an hour. They started looking for Eric and called his name through the hall, but the manor seemed to swallow their voices, giving no answer. In the shadows, the Hawthornes watched quietly, pleased with what was happening. Elliot leaned toward Clara and whispered, "It is starting," and let them fall apart. Now, the tension among the explorers grew. "What if he's with them?" Sophia whispered, and was scared. "What if they've done something to him?" Michael clenched his fists and tried to stay calm, then said, "We will stay together and no more splitting up." But even as he said it, he felt something was very wrong, because the trap was closing around them. And with each moment, it seemed like they were walking deeper into the Hawthorne's plan, one that had been carefully set and was now pulling them in more. The morning brought a discovery that crushed any hope left, because Michael, Jessica, and Sophia found Eric's lifeless body in the snow just outside the manor's walls. His face was frozen in fear, and his skin was pale and frostbitten. The sight shocked and saddened the group. Sophia knelt next to Eric, and her hands were shaking as she touched his things. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered, and her voice was trembling. "He wasn't even dressed for the cold. Why would he go outside alone?" Michael looked around, and his jaw was tight. There were no tracks leading to Eric's body. No footprints, no signs of anyone else. It was as if he had appeared there out of nowhere. Soon, the family arrived shortly after, but their faces showed no emotion. "This is a tragedy," Elliot said seriously, but his eyes showed nothing. "The cold is merciless, and you must all be careful." Michael's fists clenched because he didn't trust their sympathy. "We need answers, now." Then, Lucille stepped forward, and her voice was calm. "We understand your fear, but the cold has taken many over the years. Maybe Eric wandered out by mistake." Michael glared at her, but before he could speak, Sophia whispered, "We are next and they are doing this to us." Later, the group quickly went back into the manor, the fear and suspicion growing stronger with each step. Then, Michael gathered everyone in a room far from the family's eyes. "We need to leave tonight," he said quickly. "We will go south and back to the camp. We will take only what we need." Jessica looked out the frosted window. "And if they try to stop us?" she asked, worried. Michael's face turned hard. "Then we will fight." But even as they made their plans, the Hawthornes stayed ahead of them. Clara and Lucille moved quietly through the manor and blew out lanterns and made shadows in the rooms. Elliot locked doors with keys the group didn't have, so they couldn't explore or escape. The house seemed to work with the family. Shadows in the hallways stretched too long, and the walls groaned like they were alive. Jessica thought she saw faces in the frost-covered windows and watched them. As night came, the explorers felt the weight of their situation. They were trapped, outnumbered, and haunted by the silent threat of the Hawthornes. There seemed to be no way out, and they could only hold on to one small hope: survival. Then, their plans to escape were interrupted by a faint sound, a low, sad hum that echoed through the manor. Sophia, curious, led the others toward the noise. And then they found a door hidden behind an old tapestry. "This wasn't here before," Sophia whispered, and her breath was visible in the cold air. Then, Michael pushed the door open, revealing a narrow staircase that went down into darkness. The air became colder with every step, and a strange and metallic smell made them uneasy. When they reached the bottom, the light from a flickering lantern showed a room like nothing they had seen before. Bones, hundreds of them, and they were arranged in twisted shapes along the walls. Symbols were carved into the stone floor, glowing faintly with a blue light. In the center of the room lay Daniel, and his body cut in a disturbing way. Jessica gasped and nearly collapsed against Michael. "Oh my God, they killed him." Before they could do anything, the Hawthornes appeared at the top of the stairs. Their presence was heavy and suffocating. Elliot stood in front, and his face was unreadable. "You weren't supposed to find this," he said flatly. Clara stepped forward, her voice soft but cold. "We never wanted this, but the curse leaves us no choice." Sophia, now filled with anger, stepped forward and ignored her fear. "You kill people because of some curse. Do you even hear yourselves?" Then, Lucille tilted her head, a cruel smile on her lips. "Would you do any differently, if it meant saving your family?" Then, Elliot raised his hand and cut off the argument. "The curse demands balance. For us to live, others must die. But we are not monsters, and we will give you a choice." Michael glared at him. "What choice?" Elliot's eyes gleamed and said, "Sacrifice one of your own, willingly, and the rest may leave. But if you refuse, the curse will decide for you." The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. The silence that followed was suffocating. To Michael, his mind raced and tried to think of a way out. But the Hawthornes waited patiently, sure they had one. As the group went back upstairs, the weight of the choice pressed on them. Could they sacrifice one person to save the others? Or would refusing the Hawthornes' demand mean their doom? The cold air grew even colder, and the house seemed to hum with approval, as if it agreed with the Hawthornes' dark decision. In the dim and locked bedroom, the explorers huddled together, their whispered arguments mixed with the howling wind outside. Fear had settled into their bones, and the family's threat hung over them like a shadow. Sophia paced the room, her voice tight with frustration. "We can't let them control us, and sacrificing one of us isn't an option." Michael leaned against the wall, his face tired. "And what's the alternative? We can't fight them all because they know this place better than we do." Jessica hugged herself, staring at the frost on the window. What if we don't have to fight them? And what if we just leave? Sophia stopped pacing and glared. And how do you plan to leave when they've sabotaged everything? Do you think they will just let us walk out? The tension grew, and fear turned into mistrust. Each of them was falling apart and unable to handle the impossible choice they faced. But while the others argued, Jessica felt a tug on her sleeve. She saw Noah standing in the doorway, his face pale and his eyes full of worrying. Then he motioned for her to follow him, and his silence begging her to listen. In the quiet corridor, Noah handed Jessica a folded piece of paper. "Take this," he whispered. She opened it, revealing a hand-drawn map of the area around the manor. Then she saw a path leading away from the manor was marked with bold lines. Jessica looked at him, her voice trembling. "Why are you helping?" Noah's face twisted in guilt and defiance. "Because I can't keep doing this. My family, they are monsters, but I'm not like them. Now, you have to leave and you all do." Jessica hesitated and felt the pain of his words. "Come with us, and you don't have to stay here." Noah shook his head and stepped back into the shadows. "I can't, but you can still save yourselves. Go before it is too late." Back in the room, Sophia stopped pacing. Her gaze grew hard as she turned to Michael. "If we are going down, we are going down fighting. But we need weapons, something to defend ourselves." Michael nodded reluctantly. Her determination was strong, and for the first time, he felt a spark of hope. Even in the face of fear, they would not give up without a fight. The creaking of the manor's old floorboards was louder that night. Each sound was an eerie reminder of the danger inside. Sophia and Michael went down to the basement, feeling the weight of the darkness around them. "What are we even looking for?" Michael whispered, his breath fogging the air. "Anything sharp or heavy," Sophia answered, her voice steady despite the fear inside her. "There has to be something they haven't hidden." Later, they found what they needed when Michael opened a dusty chest. Inside were old tools, an axe with a rusted blade, a hammer, and a hunting knife. Sophia grabbed the knife, holding it tightly. "This will do." Meanwhile, Jessica unfolded the map Noah gave her. Her heart raced as she traced the path. She quietly left the room, trying to be as silent as possible. But every creak of the floor made her stop, and her breath caught in her throat. But Lucille was waiting. "Going somewhere, dear?" Lucille's voice was sharp and mocking. She stood at the end of the hall and her shadow was long in the moonlight. Jessica froze and her mind was racing. "Lucille, please, we don't have to do this." Lucille's smile grew wider, and her eyes shone with cruelty. "Oh, but we do. You see, the curse doesn't care about feelings." Then, Jessica turned and ran, holding the map tightly as she fled. Lucille's laughter followed her, and it was colder than the air around her. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the manor, Sophia and Michael were not alone, because Elliot appeared and he was blocking the stairs with his big body. "You shouldn't have gone poking around where you don't belong," he said, his voice calm but threatening. Sophia held the knife tighter and said, "And you shouldn't have underestimated us." A tense moment passed, and the silence was broken only by the sound of Jessica's hurried footsteps. Outside, in the snow-covered woods, Jessica's escape turned into a dangerous chase. Lucille moved fast and her white gown flowed like a ghost. Jessica stumbled, but Noah's map gave her a small chance to escape. But will she escape? Inside Death Manor, Sophia and Michael fought back. They attacked and used the tools they found, but Elliot's strength was strong. It was a fight for survival, with every second feeling like a risky chance against the Hawthornes. But their effort was in vain, because the Hawthorne family caught them. The cold air inside the grand hall bit at the explorer's skin as they were dragged in chains to the center of the room. The Hawthorne family stood in a circle, their faces lit by flickering candlelight. Each one wore a calm and unsettling mask. In the center of the room, was an ornate altar carved with old symbols that seemed to radiate malice. Jessica's voice shook as she fought against her restraints. "You don't have to do this. Please." Then Clara stepped forward, but her face showed no pity. "The curse demands balance. Without this, the land will destroy everything. This is the only way." Noah stood at the edge of the circle, his head lowered. He didn't want this, but he didn't speak. He didn't dare speak yet. The tension between him and his family was clear, and the silent battle raged in his mind. Sophia looked at Michael and her jaw tight. "We can't let them do this." But Michael kept his eyes on Noah because he saw something in Noah's face. Hesitation, guilt, and maybe, just maybe, a chance to escape. As the ritual began, the air felt heavy, and it was filled with an unnatural energy. The family chanted in a language that sounded harsh and strange. Now, their voices echoed off the stone walls. The explorers watched helplessly as the room seemed to change, and the candle flames flickered wildly, casting huge shadows. Then Noah stepped forward. "Stop," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chant. The family froze and looked at him in shock. "What are you doing, Noah?" Clara hissed, her calm face starting to crack. "I can't. I won't be part of this anymore," he said. Then he stepped toward Jessica and took a knife from his pocket. After that, he cut her bombs and said, "Run." Suddenly, chaos broke out. Clara lunged at Noah and screamed in anger. Elliot and Lucille moved to stop the other explorers, but Michael broke free from his captor and tackled Elliot to the ground. Then, Sophia picked up a fallen candlestick and swung it at Lucille. Noah and Jessica ran toward the door, but Clara blocked their way. "You will doom us all," she shouted, and tried to grab him. In a moment of panic, Noah pushed Clara away, but her body hit the altar, and the sacred symbols on the altar cracked. Then, a loud and terrible roar filled the room, as the power they had called turned against them. Now, the ritual fell apart, and the family's power started to fade. But as Noah turned to run, he was hit. A blade cut into his side. Lucille's eyes were wide with rage and sadness, and her face twisted. "Noah," Jessica screamed as she caught him. "Go," he whispered, and his voice was weak. "End this." With tears in her eyes, Jessica and the others ran. They left the broken family and their ruined ritual behind. Suddenly, the manor felt alive, and its halls were twisting and groaning, as if the building itself was rejecting the chaos inside. Then Michael led the way, with Sophia and Jessica close behind. Their breaths were visible in the freezing air. Every shadow seemed to reach for them, and every creak of the floorboards was a warning that the family was chasing them. Behind them, Elliot stormed through the halls, and his face was full of rage. "You can't escape," he yelled. Sophia gritted her teeth and said, "We will see about that." Then, they ran into the basement and looked for an exit. Among the broken pieces of the ritual, they found a hidden door, and it led to a coal tunnel. But before they could escape, Elliot and Clara appeared, and they blocked the way. "You think you can destroy us?" Clara spat, and her voice was full of anger. "The curse won't let you leave." Michael didn't wait. He lunged at Elliot holding a rusty axe. Then, the two fought fiercely. Then, Clara rushed toward Jessica, but Sophia stopped her. She grabbed a torch from the wall and used it to defend herself. The fight was intense. Michael managed to beat Elliot and gave him a final blow that left Elliot still on the ground. Sophia fought hard, too. She pushed Clara into the broken altar, and the burst of energy exploded and consumed Clara in a flash of light. "Go," Michael shouted, and grabbing Jessica and Sophia. Suddenly, the house began to shake because the curse, released by the broken ritual, was destroying the manor. Then the three explorers ran into the tunnel, and the walls shook around them. Behind them, Lucille's voice echoed, full of anger and despair. "This isn't over," she yelled. They saw her figure briefly in the snowstorm outside before she disappeared into the white. Finally, the explorers came out into the open. Now the cold wind cut at their faces. Behind them, the manor collapsed and was swallowed by the storm. They didn't stop running until the first light of dawn started to show in the sky. Exhausted and hurt, they fell to the snow. They were happy to be alive, but the cold truth hit them. The curse was still there. The Hawthornes were gone, but their curse remained, a shadow over the land. Jessica looked back at the ruined manor. We made it, but at what cost? Michael put his hand on her shoulder. We are alive, and that's enough for now. They kept walking and left the horrors behind, but they would always carry the marks of the Hawthorne curse with them. The frozen land slowly gave way to signs of life. In the distance, a few dim lights flickered. Jessica, Michael, and Sophia walked toward them. Their bodies were tired, and their minds were filled with memories they could never forget. Each step felt heavier because of what they had seen. When they reached the village, the locals watched them with caution, but also kindness. A small inn offered them shelter. The warmth inside was different from the cold memories that still clung to them. The fire crackled, but it didn't melt the fear they felt in their hearts. They sat around the fire, wrapped in blankets. Jessica spoke quietly, her voice trembling. Noah saved us. He didn't have to, but he did. She looked down at her hands, shaking as they held the edge of her blanket. Michael stared into the flames, his jaw tight. He made a choice none of us could have imagined. But it doesn't change what his family did. The world needs to know. Sophia nodded, her face distant. The curse, the sacrifices, it all needs to come to light. People have to understand what is hidden in that frozen land. Jessica looked at them with tears in her eyes. Do you think it's over? The curse, I mean. Did we stop it? Their room was quiet for a moment. The crackling fire was the only sound. Finally, Michael spoke. We didn't destroy it. We stopped it for now, but it's still there, waiting for someone else to find it. Jessica shivered, and fear swept over her again. She looked at the frosted window. The snowstorm had slowed down, but outside, everything was still covered in white. Sophia spoke again, her voice heavy. What about Lucille? Do you think Michael shook his head. She's gone. She has to be. No one could have survived in that storm. Jessica wanted to believe him, but doubt kept growing inside her. Noah's last words echoed in her mind. Shall never stop. They stared into the fire, hoping to feel comfort from its warmth. Suddenly, a gust of wind shook the window. For a moment, Jessica thought she saw a shadow move against the glass, but when she looked closely, there was nothing there. Still, deep in her heart, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The curse was not over. It was still alive, waiting. Maybe for them, or maybe for someone else. The Hawthornes were gone, but their terror still lived on. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Please share this video with your friends and family too. Thanks.